It was a quiet late afternoon in the city. The streets were slowly filling with the gentle hum of cars and the occasional chatter of people going about their day. Sunlight reflected off the windows of tall office buildings, casting long shadows onto the pavement. Among the crowd, a man walked carefully, keeping his eyes on the surroundings. He wore a dark suit and sunglasses, blending in easily, but he carried a sense of alertness that made it clear he was not just another office worker. This man was an FBI agent undercover on an important mission. His job required patience, observation, and the ability to react calmly under pressure. Today, he was tracking a suspect connected to a series of city crimes, and he needed every second of his focus. As the agent moved down the sidewalk, he noticed a police officer nearby. At first, he thought nothing of it. Police were everywhere in the city, walking beats or directing traffic. But then he saw the officer's eyes fix on him, narrow and suspicious. The officer was middle-aged, with a stern face and a uniform that seemed more rigid than necessary. There was a tense look in his eyes, and he stepped closer. The agent instinctively recognized the situation. This man was not just curious. He was judging, deciding something about the agent without any reason other than what he assumed. Before the agent could react, the officer drew his firearm. The sudden movement was shocking, cutting through the quiet of the street. People nearby froze, sensing danger in the air. The officer raised his gun directly at the agent, his hand shaking slightly but his face filled with determination. "Stop right there. Hands where I can see them," he shouted. His voice was harsh and commanding, echoing in the emptying street. The agent froze in place, slowly raising his hands, showing no intention to fight. He stayed calm, his mind running through options, knowing that any wrong move could escalate the situation dangerously. The crowd began to gather at a safe distance. People whispered nervously to each other, unsure of what was happening. Some tried to record the incident on their phones, while others just watched in silence, holding their breath. The tension was almost tangible, as if the city itself was waiting for someone to act. The officer, fueled by his assumptions, seemed to believe he had full control over the situation. He was confident, almost arrogant, in his belief that this man before him was a threat. But the agent remained composed, relying on his training to keep his mind clear. The agent spoke softly, choosing his words carefully. "I am an FBI agent. I am on official duty. Please lower your weapon. We don't want this to get out of control." His voice was calm and steady, the opposite of the officer's rising anger. He knew that showing fear or hesitation could make the officer more aggressive. Instead, he used control and reason, hoping to reach the part of the officer that still knew right from wrong. But the officer's prejudice was strong, clouding his judgment. He did not listen, convinced that he was the one in charge and that no rules could stop him. As the standoff continued, the agent noticed small details. The officer's finger was tense on the trigger, his breathing heavy. The man's eyes darted to the surrounding streets, perhaps seeking backup or simply looking for validation of his authority. The agent's gaze shifted to the same points, noting every movement, every sound. He understood that situations like these could escalate in seconds, and he prepared himself mentally for whatever might come next. He did not make sudden movements, keeping his body relaxed but alert, ready to respond if the officer made a wrong move. The officer began shouting again, his voice filled with suspicion. "I said stop." "Who are you? Show me your ID." He waved the gun slightly, not pointing it carelessly but using it to intimidate. The agent slowly reached into his inner jacket pocket, retrieving his FBI identification card. He showed it clearly, hoping the sight of the badge and his calm demeanor would diffuse the situation. "Here, this is me, FBI. I am not your enemy," he said quietly. The officer glanced at the badge but did not lower his weapon. Instead, his expression hardened as if seeing the badge made no difference. His mind was already set, guided by assumptions rather than facts. People in the crowd began murmuring, sensing the danger and feeling the tension grow. Some shook their heads, unable to understand why an officer would behave this way. Others felt a rush of fear for the agent, knowing that one wrong move could lead to tragedy. The agent noticed their eyes on him, but he did not waver. He remained focused, relying on his training and experience to stay in control. He understood the psychology of the officer. People like this often acted out of fear, ignorance, or bias, and addressing their emotions carefully could prevent disaster. Minutes seemed to stretch into hours as the standoff continued. The agent's mind worked rapidly, considering options. He could try to move slowly, attempt negotiation, or wait for a higher authority to intervene. He chose patience, understanding that rushing or showing aggression could trigger a dangerous response. The officer, meanwhile, seemed to grow more agitated. His anger and prejudice fed off the uncertainty, making him act with less reason and more impulse. The agent kept speaking softly, using calm words to counter the officer's hostility. "I am here to enforce the law. I am not your enemy. We both serve justice," he said, hoping reason would penetrate the fog of bias. Then a faint sound reached their ears, the distant wail of sirens approaching. The officer's head turned slightly, betraying a flicker of concern. He had not expected anyone to arrive, and now he faced the possibility of witnesses or authority figures intervening. The agent noted this carefully, understanding that the arrival of someone in charge could change everything. He stayed calm, continuing to show his hands, keeping the situation under control while he prepared for the next development. Every second was critical. A wrong look, a sudden movement, or a raised voice could escalate the moment into chaos. The tension hung over the street like a thick cloud. Bystanders edged backward, seeking safety while remaining fascinated by the unfolding drama. The agent remained still, mentally running through every scenario. He knew that in law enforcement, situations like this often depended on who had the clearest mind and the most patience. One small act of wisdom could prevent disaster, while one moment of anger or fear could ruin everything. The officer, consumed by his bias, did not yet understand that his choices were leading him to a breaking point. He held the gun tightly, eyes locked on the agent, confident in his authority but blind to the risk he created. As the agent continued to speak softly, trying to reason with the officer, he sensed a shift in the atmosphere. The city street, once quiet and ordinary, now seemed charged with tension, like a storm about to break. The agent's calmness was a stark contrast to the officer's anger, and the surrounding crowd sensed the imbalance. Some held their breath, waiting for someone to act. Others whispered prayers silently, hoping the situation would not turn violent. The agent knew that help was coming, that someone with authority would intervene before things got out of control. He stayed steady, aware that patience and composure were his greatest allies. And then, in the distance, the sound of footsteps grew louder. Someone was approaching, moving quickly but purposefully. The officer glanced toward the noise, confusion flickering across his face. He was no longer the only force on the street. Someone with real authority was coming, someone who could enforce the rules and restore order. The agent remained calm, watching both the officer and the approaching figure, knowing that the moment of change was near. The standoff had reached its peak, a tense and dangerous situation that demanded careful attention. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only test the officer's sense of power, but also show the strength of discipline, courage, and justice. The agent's calm determination, combined with the officer's bias and the approaching authority, created a moment charged with suspense. Everyone on the street could feel it, the tension, the risk, and the possibility of resolution. It was a test of character, judgment, and integrity, and the outcome would leave a lasting impact on everyone involved. The footsteps grew louder on the pavement, echoing against the walls of nearby buildings. The officer's eyes flicked toward the sound, his grip on the gun tightening slightly. The crowd around them shifted, sensing that someone in authority was arriving. Yet the officer refused to lower his weapon. He believed he was in control, that no one could challenge his judgment. His arrogance and prejudice had convinced him that this FBI agent was the threat, not him. The FBI agent kept his hands raised, his voice calm and steady. "I am not here to fight you," he said softly, choosing each word carefully. "I am here to enforce the law just like you. Let's keep this safe. We don't need anyone to get hurt." His words were deliberate and even, designed to prevent panic while reminding the officer that he was not alone in responsibility. He remained composed, knowing that any sudden movement could provoke the officer further. The officer shouted again, trying to assert his dominance. "You think showing me that badge makes you special? I'm the law here." His voice carried authority but was laced with fear and insecurity. The agent noticed the tremor in the officer's hand and the tension in his shoulders. This was not just anger, it was uncertainty, a crack in the officer's self-confidence. The agent kept his posture relaxed, but he was ready to react if necessary. Around them, the bystanders were growing more uneasy. Some were stepping back, creating a wider space around the confrontation. Others had their phones out, quietly recording. Whispers and murmurs spread through the crowd. People were drawn to the scene, sensing the danger and the drama unfolding in front of them. The agent was aware of this too, knowing that the presence of witnesses could help keep the officer in check, but it also added pressure. One wrong move in public could have serious consequences. The officer's voice rose higher, full of impatience. "Show me your credentials. Tell me why you're here. I don't care about your fancy badges." His words were angry, almost frantic. The FBI agent reached slowly into his pocket and carefully pulled out his FBI identification, holding it up so the officer could clearly see it. "This is who I am. I am on official duty, and I am not your enemy. Please put the gun down." His tone remained calm, firm, but not aggressive. He understood that fear often fed on confrontation, and keeping his voice steady could reduce the tension. The officer's eyes darted back and forth between the badge and the agent's face. He seemed unsure for a moment, almost as if he was questioning the situation. But the moment passed quickly and his stubbornness returned. He tightened his grip on the gun and took a small step forward. "I don't care. You're not in charge here. I decide who is a threat." His voice was loud enough to catch the attention of everyone nearby, and the murmuring of the crowd grew louder. The agent recognized that reasoning alone might not be enough. He needed to create a pause, a chance for intervention. "We both serve the law," he said, his voice calm but deliberate. "We both protect people. Let's not let fear or assumptions destroy that." He maintained eye contact, showing respect but also holding firm. His body was relaxed, his stance balanced, ready for whatever might happen next. Meanwhile, the city around them seemed to hold its breath. Cars slowed as drivers noticed the scene, some stopping to watch from a distance. People leaned out of windows, curious and concerned. The tension on the street was thick, and it felt like the seconds stretched endlessly. Everyone waiting for a resolution, knowing that the wrong decision could have serious consequences. The officer, however, was not ready to listen. His prejudice and ego had blinded him to reason. He kept yelling, demanding answers and asserting his authority. The agent, trained to handle situations like this, stayed composed. He did not match the officer's aggression. Instead, he spoke slowly and clearly, hoping to reach the part of the officer that could still think logically. "I am not trying to take your job or challenge you. I am here to work with you, not against you. Please lower the gun." The officer hesitated for a moment as if considering the words, but the hesitation was brief. His mind was clouded with bias, and he decided he could not back down. He continued to hold the weapon, shaking slightly as adrenaline coursed through him. His voice was loud, almost defiant. "I said stop. Do you hear me? I don't care who you are." The agent noticed the signs of strain in the officer's behavior. His breathing was uneven, his grip tight and his posture rigid. This was a dangerous combination. The agent knew that this was a moment where one wrong step could lead to chaos. He kept his hands visible, moving slowly but purposefully, never showing fear. He relied on his training to maintain control over himself, even as the officer's hostility grew. Suddenly, a new sound entered the scene. The distinct steps of someone moving quickly, but with authority. The officer's head turned sharply. His eyes narrowed, scanning the street. The agent also looked toward the approaching figure, recognizing the difference immediately. This was not another civilian. This was someone who carried power, someone who could immediately change the dynamics of the confrontation. The approaching figure moved with purpose, her steps decisive. It was the police chief, arriving just in time to intervene. She was tall, commanding, and clearly in charge. Her presence seemed to cut through the tension like a knife. The officer's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. He had not expected anyone to arrive, and certainly not someone with such authority and confidence. The chief's voice rang out, clear and firm. "Officer, lower your weapon now." She did not shout in anger. Her tone was calm but impossible to ignore. The authority in her voice demanded attention, instantly silencing the murmurs of the crowd. The officer blinked, momentarily stunned. As the chief stepped closer, her posture confident and unwavering. The FBI agent remained calm, understanding that the chief's arrival could change everything. He kept his hands visible, showing respect for her authority while also staying aware of the officer's unpredictable behavior. He watched as the chief assessed the situation in seconds, recognizing the danger in the officer's abuse of power. She did not hesitate or falter. She moved with clarity, ready to restore order. The officer's confidence began to falter. He was still holding the gun, but now he realized that he was no longer the only authority on the street. The chief's gaze was sharp and unwavering, signaling that any further aggression would have consequences. He shifted slightly, unsure of his next move. The crowd sensed the shift in power, the moment when the situation could finally be controlled. The agent took a subtle step back, giving the chief room to approach. He remained calm, speaking softly to the officer. "You see? Someone responsible is here. Let's keep this safe." His words were not a command, but a reminder that authority now had clarity and fairness. The officer's grip on the gun loosened slightly, though his face still showed anger and stubbornness. The chief stopped a few steps from the officer, her presence commanding full attention. "Lower your weapon and step back," she said firmly. Her eyes did not waver, and her posture radiated strength and control. The officer hesitated, torn between pride, anger, and the undeniable authority of the chief. He looked at the agent, then at the crowd, and then back at the chief, realizing he could no longer act without immediate consequences. The standoff reached its turning point. The city street, filled with tension for minutes that felt like hours, was now under the clear control of the chief. Her presence demanded compliance, her authority undeniable. The officer's bias and anger were no longer enough to maintain dominance. He was forced to confront the reality that his actions were unacceptable, that his behavior was being held accountable. The FBI agent exhaled slightly, maintaining his composure but aware that the danger was not entirely over. The officer had not fully surrendered, and any sudden movement could still trigger a reaction. The chief's focus remained sharp, her voice firm as she continued to command the situation. The crowd watched silently, recognizing the importance of what was unfolding. Justice and accountability were being asserted in real time, and the tension slowly began to ease. The chief's arrival changed everything on that quiet city street. Her presence was commanding, sharp, and confident. The officer, once filled with arrogance and the illusion of control, now hesitated. His eyes flicked nervously between the FBI agent and the chief, unsure of what to do next. The crowd, sensing the shift in authority, fell silent, their whispers replaced by a tense stillness. Everyone could feel the weight of the moment, knowing that the confrontation could either escalate into violence or be resolved immediately. The chief took a slow step forward, her gaze fixed firmly on the officer. "Put the gun down now," she said, her voice steady but carrying a weight that brooked no argument. It was not a shout. It was a declaration of authority. Her tone left no room for excuses. She was not merely intervening. She was demanding accountability. The officer's hands trembled slightly as he held the weapon, the tension in his body evident to anyone watching. He realized that this was no longer a simple street confrontation. He was facing someone who had the power and will to hold him responsible. The FBI agent remained calm, keeping his hands raised and his movements slow and deliberate. He understood the officer's precarious position and hoped that the chief's firm presence would finally make the man see reason. He had been trained for situations like this, and patience was one of his most valuable tools. He spoke softly without aggression, trying to support the chief's intervention. "You can resolve this safely," he said. "We can all walk away from this without anyone being hurt. Just follow her instructions." His voice was a thread of calm in the midst of rising tension, a reminder of reason and control. The officer's eyes darted around. The crowd was watching, people recording the standoff on their phones. He could no longer act as if he were alone or untouchable. Pride warred with fear inside him. He wanted to hold on to his sense of authority, but the chief's presence made it clear that he was now accountable. His grip on the gun tightened for a moment, as if he could regain control through sheer force of will. But the weight of reality pressed down on him. The chief advanced one step at a time, deliberately, carefully. Each step emphasized her authority, and the officer could feel it physically. He shifted slightly backward, unsure if he should comply or resist. His mind raced, but fear and uncertainty began to outweigh his earlier arrogance. The chief did not rush. She allowed the tension to mount just enough to make the officer feel the seriousness of his actions. Every movement she made was measured, intentional, showing the difference between authority rooted in justice and authority rooted in bias. "Do you understand the seriousness of this situation?" the chief asked, her eyes locking onto the officer's. Her question was calm but pointed. It demanded reflection, forcing the man to confront his actions. The officer's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but the words caught in his throat. The crowd sensed his hesitation, the crack in his facade of control. The chief took another step forward, closer now. "You have violated every standard of conduct we expect from our officers," she continued. "Pointing a firearm at a fellow law enforcement officer without cause is unacceptable. Your badge does not give you the right to act on bias or prejudice. Lower the weapon. Step back, now." Her voice was firm, unwavering, and it carried the authority of her office. The officer blinked rapidly, overwhelmed by the clarity and firmness in her words. The FBI agent could sense that the moment of decision was near. He remained calm, watching the officer closely, ready to react but not moving aggressively. His training told him that the chief's presence was key, and that her authority could de-escalate the situation completely. He spoke softly again, reinforcing her instructions. "It's simple. Just follow her guidance. No one needs to get hurt. You can resolve this safely." His voice was a tether to reason, helping to anchor the officer amid rising fear and anger. The officer's hands shook as he held the gun. Pride warred with fear inside him. The crowd was silent now, all eyes on the unfolding drama. He looked around, realizing that everyone was watching and that any misstep could be catastrophic. His sense of superiority, built on bias and misplaced confidence, was crumbling. The chief's eyes did not waver. She held his gaze without anger, without judgment, but with an authority so strong that resistance felt almost impossible. The officer took a small step backward, lowering the gun slightly. Though his face still showed tension, the chief did not move faster. She allowed the moment to stretch, giving him the space to realize the weight of his choices. "This is your chance to do the right thing," she said. "You can end this safely. Put the weapon down and step back. Respect the law, respect your colleagues, and respect yourself." Her words were deliberate, emphasizing accountability without humiliation. The officer's breathing grew heavier, and for a moment it seemed like he might comply. But stubbornness flared again. He raised his voice, trying to assert himself. I'm just doing my job. I don't need to listen to you." His words lacked conviction, revealing the inner conflict he felt. He wanted to believe he was right, that his actions were justified, but the chief's presence, the FBI agent's calm, and the watching crowd made it clear that he had overstepped. The chief moved closer, her presence overwhelming yet composed. She spoke again, her voice low but cutting through the tension. "Your badge does not make you above the law. Pointing a firearm at a fellow officer is a violation, and you are responsible for your actions. Step back now." The words carried the weight of both authority and consequence. The officer's shoulders slumped slightly, the first sign of surrender. He knew he could no longer act without immediate repercussion. The agent continued to observe carefully, noting the officer's hesitation. He remained calm, not provoking but ready to act if necessary. He saw the shift in the officer's posture, the rigidity giving way to uncertainty. The chief's firm presence was doing what training and reason could not. It was forcing accountability, breaking through the cloud of prejudice that had guided the officer's actions. Finally, the officer lowered the gun completely. His hands trembled as he took a cautious step backward. The crowd breathed collectively, sensing the tension ease. The FBI agent kept his hands raised but relaxed slightly, still alert but reassured by the officer's compliance. The chief stepped fully between the officer and the agent, her presence a shield of authority and control. She looked directly at the officer, her eyes unwavering. "Drop your badge," she said firmly. The command was unexpected and deliberate, leaving no room for argument. The officer froze, confusion and panic crossing his face. Pride and embarrassment warred within him, but the realization came quickly. His actions had consequences, and the chief would hold him accountable. The FBI agent stayed calm, understanding that this was the moment of reckoning. He watched as the officer hesitated, torn between ego and the undeniable authority of the chief. Every eye on the street was on them, the tension so thick it was almost tangible. The officer's hands shook as he reached for his badge, and the chief's steady gaze did not waver. The crowd could sense the unfolding justice, the moment when bias and arrogance would finally be confronted by integrity and authority. At that moment, the city street, once filled with quiet and ordinary sounds, had transformed into a stage for accountability and courage. The officer's decision would define the rest of his career, while the chief's actions demonstrated the importance of leadership and responsibility. The FBI agent remained composed, calm, and professional, a steady presence amid the storm of tension. The officer's face was red with frustration and embarrassment. He slowly handed over his badge, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The chief accepted it firmly, showing both authority and control. The crowd watched silently, recognizing the significance of the event. This was more than a confrontation. It was a lesson in accountability, integrity, and justice. The standoff, which had started with fear and prejudice, was now under control. The chief's decisive actions had de-escalated the danger, and the FBI agent remained safe. The officer was confronted with the consequences of his actions, and the public had witnessed the power of integrity over bias. Every person on the street understood the gravity of what had occurred, and the lesson was clear. Authority without accountability is dangerous, but leadership rooted in justice can resolve even the tensest situations. The air on the city street was heavy with tension. Even though the officer had lowered his gun, his pride and anger were still evident in every line of his body. The chief stood firmly between him and the FBI agent, her presence unwavering, her voice calm yet full of authority. She did not shout, but her words carried a weight that made it clear the officer could not ignore her. Every step, every glance from her reinforced that the moment for reckoning had arrived. "Do you understand what you have done?" the chief asked, her eyes steady on the officer. The words were simple, but they demanded reflection. The officer's face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. For a moment he opened his mouth to argue, to justify his actions, but the weight of the situation pressed down on him. He was no longer in control, and the presence of both the chief and the watching crowd left him with no room to maneuver. The FBI agent remained calm, his hands still visible, a steady presence that contrasted sharply with the officer's tension. He could feel the adrenaline in the air, but he knew that reacting impulsively could only worsen the situation. He watched carefully as the chief advanced another step, bringing her closer to the officer. Her posture was firm, controlled, and deliberate. She was not there to humiliate him. She was there to assert justice and ensure accountability. "Lowering your weapon was the first step," the chief continued, "but it is not enough. Your actions have consequences, and you need to take responsibility for them." Her words were measured, each syllable emphasizing the seriousness of the officer's behavior. The officer's hand shook slightly as he stood there, realizing the weight of his misconduct. He had pointed a firearm at a fellow law enforcement officer, not out of reason, but out of bias and prejudice. That realization began to break through the stubbornness he had carried for so long. The crowd around them watched in silence, fully aware that the situation was reaching a turning point. Phones were raised, capturing the moment, but no one dared to step closer. The tension that had gripped the street began to shift, from fear of immediate danger to anticipation of justice. The chief did not rush the officer. She allowed him to feel the gravity of his actions, to understand the error of his judgment. "You will hand over your badge," the chief said firmly. The command was direct, leaving no room for negotiation. The officer's face twisted with anger and frustration. His pride, his sense of self-importance wanted to resist, but deep down he knew there was no choice. The chief's authority was undeniable, and the consequences of defiance were clear. The officer hesitated, his fingers trembling as he reached for the badge clipped to his chest. He looked at the FBI agent, then at the crowd, and finally back at the chief. For a moment it seemed as if he might argue again, but the realization hit him fully. He had acted wrongly, and there was no excuse that would justify pointing a weapon at a fellow officer. With a slow, reluctant motion, he unclipped the badge and extended it toward the chief. The chief took the badge, her hands steady and firm. She did not gloat, nor did she display anger. She simply held it as a symbol of accountability, a reminder that authority carries responsibility and must be exercised with fairness and integrity. The crowd remained silent, witnessing the resolution of a situation that could have ended in tragedy. The FBI agent relaxed slightly, though he kept his awareness sharp, knowing that the officer's behavior had already demonstrated how dangerous bias could be in positions of power. The officer lowered his gaze, shame and frustration evident on his face. He had been confronted with the consequences of his actions, and there was no way to hide from it. The chief's presence had forced him to face the truth. Authority without accountability is dangerous, and prejudice can turn power into a threat. He had acted out of fear and bias, and now he had no choice but to accept the consequences. The FBI agent finally allowed himself to take a slow breath, feeling the tension on the street begin to dissipate. The chief stepped fully between him and the officer, her presence reassuring and protective. She did not need to raise her voice or make threats. Her authority was evident in every movement, in every word, in the quiet confidence she exuded. The officer stood silently, his posture slumped slightly, as if the weight of the moment had finally pressed down on him. "You will face disciplinary action for your conduct," the chief said, her voice carrying through the street. "Pointing a firearm at a fellow officer without cause is unacceptable, and bias has no place in law enforcement. Your actions endangered lives, and you will be held accountable." The words were clear, unambiguous, and final. The officer could not escape their truth, and for the first time he felt the full measure of responsibility. The crowd around them began to breathe more freely, sensing that the immediate danger had passed. People murmured quietly among themselves, impressed by the chief's calm and decisive handling of the situation. The tension that had gripped the street since the officer first drew his weapon was slowly easing, replaced by a sense of relief and admiration for the authority that had intervened. The FBI agent remained alert but relaxed slightly. He had been trained for high-pressure situations, and he understood the dynamics of human behavior under stress. He had watched the officer's pride, anger, and bias drive his actions, and he had remained calm, knowing that the arrival of someone with authority could turn the situation around. The chief's decisive intervention had prevented what could have become a dangerous escalation. The officer finally stepped back, lowering his shoulders as he did. His hands, once trembling with tension, now rested at his sides. He no longer held the gun, and the badge in the chief's hands was a clear symbol of the accountability he faced. The street was quiet now, the crowd watching in awe as the confrontation reached its resolution. The officer's arrogance and prejudice had been met with authority, integrity, and justice, and the lesson was clear to all present. Power carries responsibility, and bias cannot go unchecked. The chief turned her attention to the FBI agent. "Are you all right?" she asked, her tone calm and reassuring. The agent nodded, grateful for her timely intervention. "Yes, thank you for arriving when you did. It could have been much worse." His words were quiet but sincere, acknowledging the chief's decisive action. The officer remained silent, his face a mixture of shame and frustration. He had been forced to confront his own behavior and the consequences that came with it. The presence of the chief, combined with the calm professionalism of the FBI agent, had stripped away his arrogance and forced him to recognize the danger he had created. He had pointed a weapon at someone who was serving the law with integrity, and now he had no choice but to face the reality of his misconduct. The chief addressed the crowd briefly, her words carrying authority and clarity. "This situation is now under control. Let this be a reminder that authority must be exercised responsibly. Bias has no place in law enforcement, and everyone must be held accountable for their actions." The crowd nodded silently, absorbing the lesson in real time. The tension that had gripped the street had dissipated, replaced by a sense of order and resolution. The FBI agent took a step back, his hands still visible, his posture relaxed but ready. He had remained calm throughout the entire confrontation, understanding that patience, composure, and observation were his greatest tools. The officer's actions had been driven by prejudice and ego, but the intervention of the chief had prevented the situation from escalating further. Justice had been served, and the lesson was clear to all. Authority must be paired with integrity, and every action has consequences. As the officer was escorted away by the chief, the crowd began to disperse slowly. People whispered among themselves, reflecting on what they had witnessed. The tension that had dominated the street was now replaced by a sense of relief and admiration for the decisive handling of the situation. The FBI agent adjusted his jacket, feeling the lingering adrenaline but also a deep sense of gratitude for the chief's timely intervention. The city street returned to its normal rhythm, but the events of the afternoon left a lasting impression on everyone present. The confrontation had been intense, dangerous, and unpredictable, yet it had ended with authority, integrity, and justice prevailing. The officer's bias and misconduct had been confronted, and the FBI agent's calm professionalism had helped ensure that the situation did not spiral out of control. The chief's actions demonstrated the importance of leadership, accountability, and fairness in law enforcement. Her ability to intervene decisively without anger or aggression had prevented potential disaster and sent a clear message to all. Prejudice and bias have no place in positions of power. The officer had been forced to face the consequences of his actions, and the lesson was visible to everyone who had witnessed the events unfold. For the FBI agent, the experience was a reminder of the importance of composure and professionalism, even in the face of hostility and bias. Maintaining calm, observing carefully, and trusting in the presence of authority could prevent escalation and ensure safety. The lessons of the confrontation would remain with him, a powerful example of how discipline, integrity, and authority can work together to resolve even the most dangerous situations. The street slowly returned to a quiet rhythm, the tense energy that had gripped it for so long beginning to fade. The crowd, which had gathered in anxious silence during the standoff, began to disperse, murmuring among themselves about what they had just witnessed. The event had left a mark on everyone present, a lesson in authority, accountability, and integrity. It had been a dangerous situation, but it had been resolved through calm, decisive action rather than aggression or violence. The officer, whose gun had been lowered and whose badge had been taken, walked with a mix of shame, frustration, and realization. He had been forced to confront the consequences of his actions, and there was no escaping the weight of accountability. His arrogance, fueled by bias, had led him to a point where he had endangered not just the FBI agent, but potentially everyone around. Now, as he walked alongside the chief, escorted for disciplinary action, the gravity of the situation began to settle in. The FBI agent took a deep breath, still alert, but allowing himself a moment to relax. He had remained composed throughout the confrontation, relying on his training, observation skills, and calm demeanor to prevent the situation from spiraling into violence. Now that the immediate threat had passed, he reflected on the events of the afternoon and the lessons they provided. He realized that bias and unchecked power could turn a position of authority into a dangerous tool, but integrity, leadership, and discipline could prevent disaster even in the most volatile situations. The chief turned her attention to the agent, her expression firm but reassuring. "Are you all right?" she asked, her tone steady and calm. The agent nodded, appreciating the way she had handled the confrontation. "Yes," he said quietly. "Thank you for arriving when you did. It could have ended badly without your intervention." The chief nodded, acknowledging his words without unnecessary attention to her own actions. Her focus remained on maintaining order and ensuring that justice had been served. The crowd had begun to disperse, but several people lingered, whispering among themselves. Many were impressed by the chief's ability to de-escalate the situation with authority and calm, recognizing that her actions had prevented what could have been a serious incident. They had witnessed a demonstration of leadership, fairness, and accountability that would stay with them for a long time. The incident had been intense, but the outcome had been clear. Integrity had prevailed, and bias had been confronted. The officer walked quietly beside the chief, his face a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and contemplation. He had been stripped of his badge, a symbol of both his authority and the consequences of misusing it. He had acted on prejudice, letting bias dictate his behavior, and he now faced disciplinary action for his misconduct. The weight of the lesson pressed heavily on him, leaving no room for excuses or deflection. He had learned that actions have consequences, and that integrity and fairness must guide anyone in a position of power. The FBI agent adjusted his jacket, taking note of the lingering tension in the street. He remained alert, knowing that even after a confrontation ends, the aftermath can hold unexpected challenges. He watched the officer, understanding the human complexity behind the actions and reflecting on the importance of patience and professionalism in preventing escalation. Every decision made during the standoff had been critical, and the outcome had demonstrated the value of maintaining calm and relying on the presence of authority to enforce accountability. The chief spoke again, addressing the officer in a measured voice. "You will face the consequences of your actions," she said. "Pointing a firearm at a fellow officer is unacceptable, and prejudice has no place in law enforcement. Take this as a moment to reflect on your choices and the responsibility that comes with your position." The officer listened silently, absorbing the full weight of her words. He could feel the lesson settling in, a mixture of personal accountability and professional consequence. The crowd, still observing from a distance, began to understand the significance of what had transpired. This had not been a simple argument or a personal conflict. It had been a moment that demonstrated the importance of fairness, integrity, and leadership. The chief's decisive actions had ensured that justice was upheld, that bias was confronted, and that the FBI agent remained safe. People whispered to one another, reflecting on the lessons of authority and responsibility they had witnessed firsthand. The FBI agent finally spoke again, addressing the officer indirectly. "This could have ended very differently," he said calmly. "But it didn't. We were able to resolve this safely because patience and clear thinking prevailed. Let this be a lesson for the future." His words were not accusatory. They were reflective, acknowledging both the danger that had been present and the relief that now filled the street. He had maintained his professionalism, understanding that de-escalation often requires both patience and composure. The officer walked with a subdued posture, the reality of his actions weighing heavily on him. He had allowed bias and anger to dictate his behavior, nearly turning a routine situation into a potentially dangerous one. Now facing accountability and disciplinary action, he realized the importance of integrity and responsibility in positions of power. The lesson was clear. Authority must always be exercised with fairness, and every decision carries consequences. The chief turned to the FBI agent once more. "You handled yourself well," she said. "Your calm and professional demeanor helped prevent this situation from escalating. Thank you for maintaining your composure." The agent nodded, appreciating the recognition but keeping his focus on the overall situation. He knew that the lessons from this incident extended beyond the individuals involved. They were a reminder of the delicate balance of power, responsibility, and integrity in law enforcement. As the officer was escorted away, the street slowly began to return to normal. Cars resumed their flow, pedestrians continued their routines, and the usual sounds of the city returned. Yet the impact of the confrontation lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it. The incident had been tense, dangerous, and dramatic, but it had ended with accountability, leadership, and justice prevailing. The FBI agent walked a few steps with the chief, discussing the events calmly. "It's a reminder," he said, "that bias can be dangerous even in positions of authority, but integrity and leadership can prevent disaster." The chief nodded in agreement, reinforcing the importance of accountability and fairness in every decision made by those in power. Together, they had ensured that the dangerous situation had been resolved without harm, setting an example for everyone who had observed the incident. The officer's badge, now in the hands of the chief, symbolized the consequences of misused authority. It was a reminder that leadership comes with responsibility, and that prejudice cannot dictate actions without accountability. The FBI agent reflected on the importance of remaining calm, observing carefully and trusting in the presence of authority to ensure safety. Every step of the confrontation had highlighted the importance of patience, composure, and integrity. The crowd dispersed gradually, talking quietly among themselves about what they had witnessed. Some expressed relief that the situation had been resolved safely. Others reflected on the lessons of leadership and accountability demonstrated by the chief. The FBI agent remained a steady figure amidst the slowly calming scene, aware that he had witnessed the power of integrity in action. He understood that moments like these were rare, and that the presence of responsible leadership could prevent what might otherwise have become tragedy. The officer, now escorted for disciplinary measures, had time to reflect on the choices that had brought him to this point. He had acted on bias, allowing anger and prejudice to override reason and judgment. The chief's intervention had forced him to confront his actions and accept the consequences. This was a pivotal moment for him, a chance to understand the gravity of his decisions and the importance of integrity in law enforcement. For the FBI agent, the incident was a reminder of the challenges faced in situations where bias and authority collide. He had remained composed, professional, and observant, ensuring that he did not escalate the situation further. The chief's timely intervention had been critical, demonstrating that leadership and integrity could prevent dangerous outcomes. The lessons were clear. Authority must be exercised responsibly, prejudice must be confronted, and calm professionalism can save lives. As the city street returned to its usual rhythm, the agent walked slowly, reflecting on the events of the afternoon. He had witnessed tension, bias, and the potential for danger, but he had also witnessed integrity, leadership, and justice prevailing. The chief's actions had prevented disaster, held the officer accountable, and ensured that the principles of fairness and responsibility were upheld. The day's events would remain with him as a powerful example of how authority, when paired with integrity, can resolve even the most tense situations safely. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the pavement, the city had resumed its normal pace. People continued their routines, carrying with them the memory of a moment when tension and prejudice were met with calm, decisive leadership. The FBI agent,